The moment the Galactic Council's fleet entered the atmosphere of Korath 7, the air itself seemed to thrum with tension. An alien world with a reputation for peace, Korath 7 had long been regarded as neutral ground for diplomatic meetings. It should have been a simple inspection. It should have been routine. But when they found her, everything changed. The woman was standing alone on the edge of a bustling market square, the sun setting behind her in a streak of crimson. She wasn't supposed to be here. There was no record of her in the planetary database, no mention of her on any diplomatic clearance list. The guards, initially dismissive of her presence, quickly took note of her unregistered status. A quiet murmur spread through the crowd as the officers approached, their motion sharp, precise. They had orders: arrest the woman. "What's your name?" one of the guards asked, his voice firm but not unkind. She didn't respond. She only turned her head slowly, locking eyes with him. Her gaze was unsettling, cold, distant, as though she had seen the entire galaxy burn and was now watching everything unfold with detached amusement. The guard repeated his question. Still, she didn't speak. At first, it seemed like a simple refusal to cooperate, a challenge to their authority. But then, something strange happened. As the officers moved to detain her, her hands remained still, her posture unyielding. It wasn't defiance. It was the calm of someone who knew exactly what was going to happen, as if she had already anticipated the entire sequence of events. The arrest was swift, too swift. When the authorities attempted to transport her to the Galactic Council's ship orbiting overhead, a transmission crackled through their comm system. A high-ranking member of the Council had ordered the woman's immediate detainment. Keep her under strict surveillance. No interrogation until we receive confirmation, the voice said, cold and unbothered. We'll handle this personally. The woman was placed in a holding cell on the ship. No one could quite explain why, but the atmosphere seemed to change the moment she was aboard. The air, once sterile and mechanical, now felt heavier, as if the very walls of the ship were aware of her presence. Commander Sarek, the officer in charge of the detainment, watched her through the observation window. He had seen criminals before, thieves, rebels, assassins, but this woman was different. There was an unnerving stillness to her, a quiet that seemed to echo through the ship. She sat on the cot, her posture perfect, her eyes closed as if in meditation. "Have you learned anything about her yet?" Sarek asked one of his officers, who was reviewing her profile. The officer shook his head. "Not much. She wasn't on any registered travel logs, no official documents. We've been digging through her identification, but everything's encrypted." Sarek frowned. This wasn't just a random traveler. This was someone who had been intentionally erased from every record in the galaxy. It was as if she had never existed at all. "We've been set up," Sarek muttered. The officer nodded, but there was an unease in his eyes. "This feels wrong. How does she remain so calm? She hasn't shown a trace of fear, not even when we confronted her." "Doesn't matter," Sarek said. "We'll figure her out soon enough. The Council wants answers, and we'll deliver them." Hours later, the woman was brought to the interrogation room. Commander Sarek was waiting for her. He expected a confession. He expected fear. What he didn't expect was what happened next. The door opened, and the woman walked in without any resistance, her steps slow and deliberate. She sat down across from him, folding her hands in her lap. The silence stretched on. Finally, Sarek leaned forward. "Why did you come here?" he demanded. "What were you doing on Korath 7? The woman's eyes met his, unwavering. For a moment, he thought he saw something in them, a flicker of recognition, a glimmer of something ancient, something that didn't belong. "I came to warn you," she said quietly. Sarek's brow furrowed. "Warn us? About what?" She leaned in slightly, her voice lowering to a near whisper. "The galaxy is about to change, and when it does, you won't be ready." Before he could respond, the lights in the room flickered once, then went out. The comm system went dead, and for the briefest moment, the entire ship seemed to hold its breath. Commander Sarek's pulse quickened. Something was happening, something far bigger than an unregistered woman in a holding cell. And for the first time, he wondered if the arrest of this one woman would be the mistake the Galactic Council would regret forever. The silence in the interrogation room was deafening. Commander Sarek sat across from the woman, the weight of her words still heavy in the air. "The galaxy is about to change," she had said. And then nothing. No follow-up, no explanation. Just a quiet, unsettling calm. His mind raced as he studied her. She hadn't uttered a word since that cryptic statement, her expression as unreadable as the first time they met. Her eyes never wavered from his, but there was something off, a glint of something ancient, something he couldn't place. She wasn't acting like a typical criminal. She wasn't acting like anyone he had ever encountered before. Sarek leaned back in his chair, keeping his gaze fixed on her. He had interrogated criminals, insurgents, and spies, but there was something different about this woman. She was impossible to read. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't intimidated. And yet, there was a quiet power emanating from her, a stillness that unnerved him. "Why aren't you speaking?" Sarek asked, his voice low. "What are you hiding?" The woman didn't respond. She simply stared at him, her expression as calm and detached as ever. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Sarek's patience was wearing thin, but something told him not to push too hard. This wasn't a woman who would break under pressure. She wasn't like the others. He glanced at the monitoring system. Her vitals were normal. No sign of stress. No sign of anything. She was an enigma, someone who had been erased from every record, a shadow in the galaxy's vast data streams. How could someone like her simply vanish? Sarek straightened in his chair, his mind racing. Whoever she was, she had power, and not just the kind that came from knowledge. There was something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. His instincts told him this wasn't just about an arrest. This wasn't just about a rogue agent or a spy. This was about something much bigger. He pressed a button on the table, and a holographic display of her travel records flickered to life. Nothing. Her personal information was non-existent. There were no registration logs, no transponder readings, no identity markers. It was as if she didn't exist. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. He turned his attention back to her. She was still sitting there, as calm as ever. He could almost feel the tension in the room, though she showed no outward sign of it. Suddenly, her lips parted, but it wasn't to answer his question. Instead, her voice came out in a soft, almost eerie tone. "You think you know everything about me. But you don't. And you never will." Sarek's pulse quickened. "What does that mean?" She finally broke her silence, speaking slowly, as though choosing each word with precision. "The galaxy has a way of forgetting. But some things are impossible to forget." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving his. "You're playing with forces far older than you can comprehend. Forces that have waited millennia for this moment." Sarek froze. He felt the air in the room shift, a subtle change he couldn't quite explain. There was something in her words, a heaviness, a foreboding sense of doom. And he realized, for the first time, that the woman was not just a threat. She was a warning. "Who are you?" Sarek's voice was barely above a whisper. The question had left his mouth before he could stop it, but he didn't care anymore. She was more than an enigma. She was a key, if only he could unlock the door. She smiled faintly, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was the smile of someone who had seen far too much, who knew far too much. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." Sarek's frustration bubbled to the surface. "Then make me believe." The woman's smile faded. She glanced at the table, her gaze momentarily distant. "You wouldn't be able to comprehend it. Not yet. But you will." Before Sarek could respond, the room's lights flickered, then went dark. The brief hum of the station's backup power kicked in, but the lights never returned. The screens and monitors went black, and for a moment, everything was silent. Sarek's hand instinctively went to the sidearm at his waist. "What just happened?" he demanded. The woman didn't move. Her expression remained unchanged, but there was something different about her now. Something that felt like the calm before a storm. Then, without warning, the backup systems shut down. The door to the room opened automatically, but no one entered. Sarek stood up, drawing his weapon, his mind racing. "Get me a status report," he shouted to the comm system, but there was no response. The woman's gaze shifted to the door, and she spoke again, her voice low and eerie. "It's already begun." In that moment, Sarek realized the full weight of her words. Whatever game they were playing, they were no longer in control. Whatever storm she had hinted at was already on the horizon, and it was coming for them. The room was cold, too cold for comfort. Commander Sarek stood before the flickering display, his mind churning with questions that had no answers. The woman's cryptic words echoed in his head. Asterisk, it's already begun. Asterisk, what had she meant? And why, in the middle of their interrogation, had everything gone dark? As the minutes passed, frustration settled over Sarek like a heavy cloak. The backup power systems were stable now, but the message was clear. Whoever, or whatever, she was more than just an unregistered traveler. She was a harbinger. He paced the small command room, his hands clenched behind his back. It had been hours since the power failure. They had no word from the station's security network, and the woman remained silent in her cell, untouched. But something had changed. Sarek could feel it in the air, like the faintest crackle of static before a storm. The officer at the console broke his reverie. "Sir, we've located something you need to see." Sarek's heart skipped a beat. He nodded sharply, his gaze never leaving the officer. "What is it?" "It's her," the officer said hesitantly. "We found something buried in the archives, a record, but it's ancient. It doesn't make sense." The screen flickered once more as the officer called up the data. The images were grainy, old, like they belonged to a forgotten era. But the figure in the hologram was unmistakable. The woman. Where was this taken? Sarek's voice was sharp now, his curiosity piqued. The officer swallowed. "It's a recorded meeting from the First Galactic Council, more than 2,000 years ago." Sarek froze. The First Galactic Council had been long dissolved, its members scattered to the corners of the galaxy after the Great Collapse. But here she was, standing in the center of the council chamber, older but unmistakably the same woman. He leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing. The footage showed her speaking to the ancient council members, her presence commanding, as if she were no stranger to power. The file was sparse, but it was enough to make Sarek's blood run cold. The date was 2,000 years old. The woman had existed far longer than anyone could have imagined. But why had she been erased from the galaxy's historical records? "What is she?" Sarek muttered, almost to himself. The officer hesitated. "The records don't tell us much. It's almost as if someone intentionally erased her identity from history. But the footage matches accounts of a pivotal moment in galactic history, right before the collapse of the First Council." Sarek's mind raced. The collapse of the First Galactic Council had been one of the most significant events in history, a cataclysmic series of betrayals and civil wars that fractured the entire galaxy. To think that this woman had been a part of that, it didn't add up. "This doesn't make sense," he said, his voice low with disbelief. "If she was involved in the collapse, why didn't we know about her?" The officer's voice trembled. "There's more. A second recording, from just before the collapse, shows her walking into the archives of the First Council with a device, something unknown. We couldn't recover much from the footage, but it's clear she was looking for something important." Sarek's pulse quickened. Looking for something, was that what this was about? A woman, erased from the annals of history, searching for a long-lost secret? Suddenly, a sharp chime echoed through the room. The comm system hummed to life. "Commander Sarek," a voice crackled. "We've detected an anomaly in the system. Something old is waking up. It's moving, and it's heading in our direction." Sarek's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of anomaly?" I don't know, sir," the voice replied, now tinged with fear. "It's massive, and it's not from any known source." Sarek's eyes flicked back to the grainy footage of the woman. She had been searching for something, and now it seemed that whatever she had been looking for was finally coming to life. He turned to the officer. "Prepare the ship. We need to make contact with the woman. Now." As he moved quickly toward the exit, The weight of the situation pressed down on him. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a matter of one woman's mysterious past. It was something far larger, something that had been dormant for millennia. And the galaxy wasn't ready for what was about to awaken. The hum of the ship's engines was a constant in the background, but for Commander Sarek, it might as well have been deafening. His mind buzzed with 1,000 thoughts, each more chaotic than the last. They had found her. They had uncovered part of her past, but it wasn't enough. It was far from enough. And now, with every moment that passed, the weight of her silence felt heavier. She wasn't just hiding something. She was waiting. Sarek couldn't understand why the woman, whom he had come to suspect was far more than just an unregistered traveler, remained so calm. Even now, after everything they had discovered, she hadn't flinched. Not once. She sat in her cell as though she had all the time in the universe. Like everything was unfolding exactly as she had planned. And perhaps it was. His boots clicked sharply against the metal floor as he approached the observation deck. Below, in the holding cells, the woman sat motionless, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap as though in meditation. There was no sign of distress, no sign of fear. She was utterly still, an enigma that defied every instinct Sarek had ever known. She was a piece of something bigger, a key that had been locked away for far too long. Sarek activated the intercom, his voice calm but with an edge. Release her from the cell. Take her to the interrogation room. His orders were simple, but he could feel the gravity of them pressing on him. He was no longer sure if they were questioning her, or if she was questioning them. And yet, something told him that this next conversation would be different. They had learned so much, but the pieces still didn't fit. He needed to know more. He needed to know why. The woman entered the interrogation room, as composed as ever. She looked at Sarek, but her eyes held no fear. There was nothing in them, just an unsettling calm. She wasn't a prisoner. She was the one in control. And Sarek felt it. She sat down across from him, folding her hands neatly on the table. Sarek studied her for a moment, trying to find something, anything, that might hint at her true intentions. Her silence was maddening, but he wasn't going to let it break him. Not now. You've been quiet long enough, Sarek said, his voice colder than intended. We've uncovered parts of your history, your connection to the First Galactic Council, your role in the events that led to its collapse. You're hiding something, and I want to know what it is. The woman's eyes flicked to him, but she didn't respond immediately. She was waiting for him to continue, to push her further. But she knew what he wanted, and she wasn't going to give it to him. Not yet. Why did you disappear from history? Sarek's voice grew more forceful. You were there at the collapse, and yet there's no record of you. No trace. We found fragments, pieces of you scattered across time. But you're a ghost. You were erased. The woman finally spoke, her voice soft but full of weight. I wasn't erased. I was hidden. There's a difference. Sarek's brow furrowed. Hidden? From who? From them, she replied, her gaze unwavering. From those who would rather see the galaxy burn than let the truth be known. She paused, as if considering how much to reveal. I wasn't meant to be found. Not yet. But now it's happening. Everything is about to change. Sarek leaned forward, his frustration growing. You're talking in riddles. Give me something concrete. What is it you're hiding? The woman's lips twitched upward, but it wasn't a smile. I'm hiding the truth. The truth about what happened to the First Galactic Council, about what it truly was, and what it was meant to protect. Sarek sat back in his chair, trying to digest her words. And what was that? Her eyes darkened for a moment, the faintest flicker of emotion crossing her face. There's a weapon older than the galaxy itself. The Council's collapse was no accident. It was a warning. They were trying to contain something that, if it's released, could end everything. Sarek's mind reeled. A weapon? What kind of weapon? The woman's gaze held his, almost pitying. The kind of weapon that could change the fabric of the galaxy itself. It's not something that can be controlled. Not by anyone. Sarek's voice was low and steady. And you think the Galactic Council, *my *Council, can't stop it? She shook her head slowly. No. You won't be able to stop it. You're already too late. The room seemed to close in on Sarek. His pulse quickened as the woman's words sank in. If what she said was true, and something in him told him it was, then they were on the brink of something far worse than an intergalactic war. They were on the edge of an extinction event. And the council had no idea. He stood up abruptly, unable to sit still any longer. What does this have to do with you? Why did you come here? What is your role in all of this? The woman stood as well, her movements fluid and graceful. She walked slowly toward him, her eyes never leaving his. I came to stop it, to prevent the galaxy from tearing itself apart. But it's no longer just about that. It's about who will be left standing when it's over. Sarek's breath caught in his throat. And who will that be? She met his gaze, her voice a whisper. The ones who are ready to face the truth. Before Sarek could respond, the ship's systems beeped. An alert flashed across his console, but the woman's words had already settled in his mind like a stone in his gut. Whatever was coming, they were no longer in control. And they were running out of time. The alarm blared across the ship, its shrill tone cutting through the tense air like a blade. Commander Sarek's heart skipped a beat as the emergency lights flickered on. Something was happening. Something big. The woman, who had been silent and still for days, was now the center of it all. Sarek didn't hesitate. He stormed down the hall toward the command deck, his boots echoing against the metal floors. His mind was racing. She had said it herself. Asterisk, it's already begun. Asterisk, and now, with every passing moment, it seemed more likely that the galaxy was teetering on the edge of something catastrophic. He burst onto the command deck, his eyes immediately locking onto the chaotic display screens. The officers were scrambling, trying to make sense of the anomaly that had suddenly appeared in their sensors. A massive object was approaching their position, too large to be a ship, too irregular to be anything known. What is that? Sarek demanded, his voice sharp as a whip. One of the officers quickly turned to face him. We don't know, sir. It appeared out of nowhere. No warning, no signature. It's moving fast and on a direct course toward us. Sarek's mind flashed to the woman's words. The weapon. She had spoken of something older than the galaxy itself. Was this it? Was the galaxy's fate now hanging by a thread with the woman, the one they had captured, the one they thought was a prisoner, holding the key? Give me a full analysis, Sarek barked. I want to know what we're dealing with. He turned to the holographic display, watching as the object on the screen grew closer. It was huge, its shape unlike anything he had ever seen. It seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and Sarek felt a cold chill run down his spine. Whatever it wasn't just a threat. It was the culmination of everything the woman had warned them about. She knew this was coming, Sarek muttered to himself. He looked toward the officers, who were still working frantically to stabilize their systems. The ship was already on high alert, but there was little they could do. This object was beyond their capabilities. It was something from another time, another age, something that had no place in the galaxy as it was now. Is she still in her cell? Sarek asked abruptly, his eyes narrowing. Yes, sir, the officer replied, glancing up from the console. She hasn't moved since the alarm started. Sarek didn't waste another second. He turned on his heel and marched down the hallway toward the detention wing. His thoughts were a blur, but one thing was clear. Whatever was coming, it had something to do with her. And, if anyone had the answers, it was the woman they had locked away. When Sarek reached the cell, he found her sitting exactly as she had been when they first took her, calm, collected, as though nothing had changed. But something in the air had shifted. It was palpable. The weight of impending disaster hung over them like a storm cloud. He opened the door, his eyes never leaving her. What is it? He demanded. What's happening? She didn't immediately respond. Instead, she looked up at him with those same unsettling, emotionless eyes. There was no fear in them, no panic, just the quiet presence of someone who knew exactly what was unfolding. You've already started to feel it, haven't you? She said softly. The pulse. Sarek's breath caught. The pulse. She nodded slowly, her hands resting gently on her knees. The galaxy has a heart, Commander. It beats in rhythms older than you can understand. And the pulse you're feeling right now is the signal. The weapon is awakening. Sarek gritted his teeth. You were hiding this from us. You knew this was coming, and you let it happen. Her gaze softened, almost pitying. I didn't let it happen. I couldn't stop it. But you can still make a choice. The pulse is here, and it's bringing with it a power that can either destroy everything or change it all. His head spun. Change it all? What do you mean? She leaned forward slightly. The weapon was never meant to be used. But the Council, in its arrogance, sought to control it. They thought they could keep it locked away. Now the galaxy will either accept it or it will burn. Sarek stood frozen, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always believed that the Council's power could withstand anything. But what if she was right? What if they had made a mistake by keeping her locked away? What do we do? He asked, his voice tight with urgency. She stood up slowly, her movements deliberate. You're already too late to stop it. But you can still prepare. You have one last chance. Sarek's heart pounded in his chest. He knew what he had to do. If there was any hope of saving the galaxy, it rested with this woman, the one who had been waiting for this moment for centuries. As he turned to leave, the pulse grew louder, vibrating through the very walls of the ship. The galaxy was changing, and no one, not even the Galactic Council, would be able to stop it. And in that moment, Sarek understood. They weren't the ones in control anymore. The pulse shook the ship once more, the metallic groan reverberating through the corridors like the deep thrum of a dying star. The galaxy was changing, and the weight of that change pressed down on Commander Sarek like a vice. Every piece of data, every scrap of intelligence they had gathered, pointed to the same terrifying truth. The weapon was real, and it was coming for them. Sarek stood in the command deck, his eyes fixed on the holographic display. The object that had appeared on their sensors was now mere hours from reaching their position, a silent juggernaut pulling them into its gravitational pull. It was impossible to outrun. It was impossible to fight. We're running out of time, an officer said, her voice strained. If it gets any closer, we'll lose all control over the ship. The object is disrupting our systems. Sarek didn't answer. His gaze was still locked on the screen, his mind racing. The woman had been right. This wasn't just a threat to their fleet. It was a threat to the entire galaxy. And if they didn't act soon, everything they had built, everything they had fought for, would be wiped away in an instant. The door to the command deck slid open with a soft hiss, and a figure stepped inside. It was the woman. Her presence was calm, but there was a finality in her steps that sent a chill down Sarek's spine. She knew something that he didn't. And for the first time since their encounter, he didn't want to know what it was. You're too late, she said, her voice soft but cutting through the room like a blade. The pulse has begun. The weapon is here. Sarek didn't turn to face her, but his fists clenched at his sides. What is it? What is this weapon? She stepped closer, her eyes meeting his. It's not a weapon in the way you think. It's a force that can reshape the very fabric of the galaxy. The Council tried to control it, but they didn't understand. And now it's waking up. Why didn't you stop it? Sarek's voice was a harsh whisper. You knew this was coming. You knew what the consequences would be. I couldn't stop it, she said simply. The galaxy has its cycles, its pulses. Every few millennia, the power awakens. And when it does, the galaxy must make a choice, adapt or burn. Sarek turned to face her, his gaze intense. And what is that choice? What do we have to do to survive this? She looked at him for a long moment, as though deciding how much to reveal. The choice is simple. The galaxy must accept the truth, or it will be consumed by it. There is no middle ground. The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Sarek's heart raced. The Council, with all its power, its arrogance, had they brought this upon themselves? Had they, in their attempts to control the galaxy, doomed it to destruction? You're telling me, Sarek began, his voice trembling with the weight of the decision, that we have to surrender to this force? To this weapon? The woman's gaze softened, but her words were resolute. Not surrender, but embrace it. The galaxy has been fractured for too long. It has been controlled by fear, by those who seek power for themselves. The pulse, the weapon, it is a chance for the galaxy to unite, to heal, to begin again, but only if it is willing to face its truth. Sarek swallowed hard. And if we don't? If the Council refuses to accept it? She didn't need to answer. The answer was clear in the cold, unblinking eyes that met his. The ship's alert system blared again, snapping him from his thoughts. The object was closer now, its influence pulling at the very fabric of the ship's systems. It was no longer just a threat, it was a countdown. Sarek's mind raced. He had always been taught that power, control, and the Council's authority were the foundations of peace. But this was something else. The galaxy was on the brink of something unimaginable, and the Council was faced with a choice it had never prepared for. He turned to the officers around him, their faces pale, their hands trembling as they watched the ship's systems fail one by one. His voice was firm. Prepare for the worst. Initiate evacuation procedures. The woman's gaze never left him. You're making the wrong choice. Sarek's jaw clenched. We don't have a choice. With a final look at the woman, Sarek turned and strode to the command console. His fingers flew over the controls as he attempted to override the ship systems, but it was futile. The object was too close now. Its power was overwhelming, inescapable. Then, a voice crackled through the comms, calm but urgent. Commander Sarek, the object is signaling us. It's transmitting a message. We need to respond. Sarek's heart stopped. He glanced at the woman, whose eyes were now filled with an emotion he hadn't seen before, Hope Star. She knew what was coming. She had been preparing for it. He swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he reached for the comms console. What is the message? The answer came not through words, but through a pulse, a wave of energy that vibrated through every fiber of the ship. A voice, not human, not alien, but something older, something vast, resonated deep within his mind. The choice is now yours. Sarek's fingers hovered over the controls as the galaxy waited. And for the first time, he understood. There was no going back. The fate of everything, the Council, the galaxy, rested in their hands. And in that moment, Sarek knew what he had to do. The choice was his. But it wasn't his alone. The galaxy was watching. The air was thick with tension as Sarek's fingers hovered over the comms console. The galaxy, on the edge of annihilation or rebirth, waited for his response. The pulse, the ancient force that had shaken the ship to its core, reverberated through every fiber of his being. And with it a voice, an immense presence that transcended space and time, whispered again in his mind. The choice is now yours. He glanced at the woman, whose calm gaze held his unblinking. She knew. She had always known. She had walked the path that led them here, and now it was his turn to walk it too. He felt the weight of the moment. The lives of billions were at stake. The power that had been unleashed had the potential to either bind the galaxy together or fracture it beyond repair. The Council's authority, the political systems that had governed the galaxy for eons, were now irrelevant. What remained was a choice, adaptation or destruction. The woman spoke, her voice soft but filled with quiet conviction. There is no power in resisting what is already destined. You must choose to embrace it, Commander. The galaxy will either rise anew, unified in purpose, or it will burn under the weight of its own division. Sarek's mind raced. Was she right? Could the galaxy truly unite under this ancient force? A power so vast and incomprehensible? Or was this just another form of tyranny, one that disguised itself as salvation? The voice in his mind spoke again, louder this time. The pulse is the truth. Accept it, and the galaxy will thrive. Reject it, and you will watch everything you have known fall apart. Sarek closed his eyes, steeling himself against the torrent of uncertainty and fear that raged inside him. He knew that no matter what he chose, it would change everything. The Galactic Council could not remain the same. No institution could. The galaxy could no longer live under the illusion of control, not when something so profound had awakened. His fingers touched the comms console. Hours later, a message was broadcast across the galaxy. To the leaders, the peoples, the survivors of the galaxy, Sarek's voice echoed in every corner of space, a quiet authority that carried the weight of a new era. The time has come for us to face the truth of who we are. We stand at the crossroads of our future, a future shaped by a power that predates even our oldest civilizations. The pulse is not an enemy, nor a weapon. It is a catalyst, a force that can unite us, if we choose to embrace it. The old systems are crumbling, and we must adapt. Together, we will rise. Together, we will rebuild. But if we refuse to change, if we cling to our divisions, we will be swept away by the tide of history. This is the choice we face. He paused, his voice steady despite the enormity of the moment. I have made mine. It is time for the galaxy to make its own. As the transmission ended, Sarek turned to the woman who had stood by him through it all. Her expression remained unchanged, but there was something in her eyes, something that could only be described as approval. You've chosen well, she said simply. Sarek nodded, though he knew the hardest part was still to come. There would be resistance, of course. There always was. There were those who would never accept this change, who would rather fight to the death than let go of their power. But there would also be others who would see this as an opportunity for something greater, something beyond the constant cycle of war and division. We will see how they respond, Sarek said, his voice quiet but firm. The woman smiled faintly. It is not the response of the old systems that matters, Commander. It is the response of the people. The galaxy had been on the brink of destruction, but now, for the first time in eons, it had the chance to begin again. The weapon, the pulse, was not a force of annihilation, but one of transformation. As the ancient power flowed through the galaxy, it did not tear apart civilizations. It bound them together. Systems that had once been at odds began to shift. Governments that had clung to the old ways realized they were powerless against the truth. There were rebellions, of course. There were those who fought against the change, who feared what they could not control. But they were no longer the majority. The people, the citizens of the galaxy, had made their choice. They had chosen to embrace the pulse, to face the truth and build a future that was different from the fractured past they had known. And as the stars burned bright in the sky, Sarek knew that the galaxy was entering a new era, a time of uncertainty, yes, but also of unprecedented potential. The galaxy would no longer be ruled by the old powers, by the fractured remnants of the First Galactic Council. It would be governed by something far more powerful, the will of the people, united under the pulse of truth. And in that unity, they would find strength. In the face of change, they would find hope. The galaxy had survived its darkest hour. The question now was not whether it would endure, but what it would become. And for the first time, Sarek believed they had the chance to build something truly new, a galaxy born not from fear or division, but from a shared purpose. And as the woman stood beside him, looking out at the vastness of space, Sarek knew that this was only the beginning.